Hey, welcome to my channel. I'm Tom Neiman, and today on Paint and Draw with Tom, we're going to talk a little bit about Edgar Payne's composition of outdoor painting. This is an invaluable book that provides insights into some of the basic forms that we see commonly used in successful paintings out in the real world. And these forms that Edgar Payne codified so many years ago offer us a little bit of structure in as far as how we can think effectively about approaching the designs of our paintings while we're out in the woods or along the shore, and thinking about laying down those initial shapes within our painting in a way that are more likely to lead to successful outcomes. So, as is the case with any sort of complicated activity like painting or certain things related to music or athletics, it's always good to have some stable, widely regarded, effective rules that can be followed, especially in the beginning, because once we learn the rules and internalize them, we can break them and still be effective. So let's learn a little bit more about Edgar Payne's design stems that he presents throughout the book. And I'll share some of my thoughts in as far as how we can practically apply those rules when we're trying to paint out in nature. So first design stem that we'll cover here today is called the Steelyard. And I'm just sketching using a brown Sharpie in a multimedia pad that I've had lying around for quite some time. Occasionally I'll do little watercolor sketches and other things here. Steelyard is one of those common formats that Edgar Payne codified in his book, Composition of Outdoor Painting. And it's a very simple design. We see it quite often in paintings from just about every era that I can think of. Usually we'll find a little bit of a lower horizon set below the halfway point at some point, usually breaking the canvas into thirds or somewhere between thirds and quarters. And there's going to be one large shape, usually in this case, because this is, in this little sketch, we're depicting a landscape painting. There's a large mass of trees closer to the foreground. We'll just, in this little thumbnail sketch, we'll use very simple shapes and won't spend a lot of time on creating illusions of detail. The purpose of this is simply to show how we can construct a painting that aligns with Payne's principles related to design. So once again, we're using the Steelyard design here, building in the large massive trees on one side of the scene. We see that this large mass of trees breaks through the horizon line, extends up into the sky. The intention is to show scale with those trees rising up into the sky. And then with the Steelyard design, we'll typically see a smaller shape off into the distance, somewhere about mid-ground. In many cases, you might see it shift into the foreground or even off into the background. In this case, we have a smaller mass of trees. It's more like a mix of a little evergreen with a little bush or something alongside of it here. And this brings about a sense of balance and distance, and it draws the eye through the space that is left between the larger mass and the smaller mass. And you'll see as we make our way throughout these compositional designs or design stems that oftentimes there are compounding designs involving multiple design stems, but that's the Steelyard. So now we're going to move on to our second design stem. And it's going to be the balanced scale design stem. This is one, in all honesty, I have not used very often, and that is largely a function of where I live. Living in the Northeast area of Pennsylvania, spending most of my time in the woods, I just haven't had the opportunity to incorporate this. And that's a function largely of how our geography and topography is laid out. Also, the limited time I have to paint. But you'll see here with the balanced scale design stem, this can be used in instances where we have a large mountain or we have towering clouds or any shape that would lend the opportunity to build a broad design stem that is oriented toward symmetry, and also in a scene where the conveyance of scale is helpful to kind of create the feeling that we want to create with the particular scene that we're painting. So here, I'm sketching out a landscape scene with a mountain range in the distant midground and putting in some tree masses in the foreground, and we have that large cloud mass building up over the mountain range. And the balanced scale design stem is helpful in instances where we want to focus in on natural symmetry or somewhat asymmetrical symmetry, like we often will see in nature, which can be quite stunning, especially in a scene like this one. If you could imagine, being in a field, looking off to the distance, seeing a mountain range, and then seeing a huge cloud mass. Quite often you see these sorts of scenes appear in summer, where you have hot, steamy afternoons, and perhaps maybe storm clouds are building. And quite often it could be an incredible scene, and one that can make a really interesting painting. In this case, through happenstance or through maybe rearranging a painting, if you're brave enough to do that, you can create a balanced symmetry, even though it's highly unusual to see such symmetry in nature, and it can help evoke different emotions. One of stability, if that's something you're interested in doing. One of power and maybe even divine grace in some instances. Not to get religious or spiritual, but that can be one of the outcomes of this sort of design stem when used correctly. So this is the balanced scale design stem, and you can see it does create a nice image. And we'll move on to one of my favorite design stems, which is the O or circle. I've used this a couple of times, and it's important for me to note that, even though I'm using these little thumbnail sketches, which are almost replicas of the thumbnail images that Edgar Payne included in his book, Composition of Outdoor Painting, you can repurpose and reapply these design stems. So in this instance, I'm drawing the outline, kind of indicating the shoreline of a lake, as if I were looking down upon a ridge, high up. And you see that the lines associated with this shoreline create a circle. In this case, it's slightly off-center within the canvas or thumbnail square or rectangle that I drew. But it creates a circle or an O. And this particular design stem can do a really good job of drawing the viewer around the canvas, leading the viewer's eye around the canvas, taking in all of the shapes within the surface and the scene within the painting. And then it can further draw the eye of the viewer into the painting And you could do this by arranging shapes around the circle and playing with values, lights and darks, and so on and so forth, within and amongst the shapes found within and outside of the circle. So in this case, we're using the view of the shoreline of a lake to kind of create this design stem known as O or circle. But you could also use other scenarios, whether it be just the arrangement of foliage amongst trees or patterns in a field, or in some cases breaks within, let's say, a forest, in the arrangement of the foliage and tree branches and trunks. They too could create this O or circle sort of configuration. So there's multiple applications. You could use cloud masses as well if that's something you're interested in incorporating into this and using this particular design stem for. And I think it does a really good job of allowing for an effective design of a painting. And obviously, if you're able to incorporate some interesting colors, some interesting scenery, that'll go a long way to accentuate this particular design stem. And this is one too that very easily can be adapted in a way that incorporates either subtly or in an obvious fashion other design stems alongside of or within the circle or O design stem. For example, the radiating line design stem, which we'll discuss in just a few moments, and also the tunnel design stem, and others can be incorporated very easily within the circle or O design stem. So I'm just adding a few details, looking to suggest maybe some reflections in the water. And I think we're done sketching out this design stem, the O or the circle design stem. Then we're going to move on to the S or compound curve design stem. This too is one of my favorites. You'll see this design stem utilized in scenes where maybe you have a meandering river, stream, or creek flowing off into the distance, or perhaps maybe a path through the woods, or a road making its way over the countryside, or maybe even through a city in some instances. So you can see here we have some curvy shapes, and we're using perspective and kind of a haphazard way to create the suggestion that this riverbed is flowing over the countryside. And you have compound, in this case, it's not a simple S, it's a compound S because there's multiple shifts in the direction. But in general, it's an S shape. And this does a really nice job, especially through the effective use of perspective, to draw the eye into the painting, and is quite effective at developing the illusion of depth within a painting. Now we're going to move on to the triangle or pyramid design stem. And in this case, because this is one of those versatile design stems that can be utilized in a number of ways, we're going to show two thumbnail sketches, so two common scenarios for which this particular design stem can be utilized for. So I'm going to draw my two rectangles, and we're going to get started with the triangle or pyramid design stem. In this case, I'm going to have a lower horizon line, and we're going to use a mass of trees ultimately to build the pyramid or triangle design stem. So we're just laying in some lines in our little thumbnail here to create the illusion of there being a little bit of texture within the landscape. Perhaps maybe this is a field of rolling hills leading into rolling hills in the background. And in this field, there are some trees, perhaps maybe some brushes or brushy, scrubby trees, and then one large mass of trees, which will include, several tree trunks. And we'll have them going off in a bunch of different directions. Ultimately, these are important details, but they're not critical components of the design itself. The critical component of the design itself, we're laying that in right now, which is the general bigger shapes created by the massive trees and its branches and foliage extending up into the sky. Now, this is not a pyramid or a triangle in the literal sense, but it is generalized. The generalized shape that it creates ultimately is similar to a pyramid or a triangle in that the base of the shape is wide and it comes to a narrow point near the center of the shape. This particular design stem is one that can be used to lead the eye around the painting, much like the circle or O design stem, but this particular design stem is one that can convey an emotion of strength and stability. If you think about it, it's quite often going to be utilized in the effort to paint a scene that involves a large mass of trees like this. It also can be used to help paint a scene with a large mountain peak. If there's one single mountain kind of standing out in a field of mountains, perhaps maybe think of a large mountain like Mount Everest, or paintings that you may have seen of the Rock of Gibraltar, for example. Those would be instances where the pyramid or triangle design stem might be put to use. Now we're going to use it in a different way here in this second thumbnail, and we're going to draw a scene that incorporates three distinctly separate shapes arranged in a triangle format. So we started with a horizon line that was low, but not quite as low as the earlier thumbnail image we used. And we're going to arrange shapes indicating trees standing within the ground plane here, each on one side, and then we will draw a little cloud up in the sky toward the center and near the top of the sky, arranged in a triangular format. So here you have the semblance of a triangle or a pyramid by virtue of arranging certain key elements within this painting in this shape. And quite frankly, this is one that I have not used all that often in my paintings. The opportunity just simply hasn't come about for me to do so. It's one I do look forward to trying to utilize as I explore different areas and different landscapes over time. Now, once again, this is the pyramid or triangle design stem. Now we're going to move on to the cross design stem. This is one that you'll commonly see when you appreciate painters that will take on scenes like harbor scenes or tall ships sailing off in the not too distant sea, or perhaps maybe artists that paint in the desert plains where there might be telephone poles that cut through the horizon line. In this case, we have a low horizon line indicating the horizon we'd find in water. And I'm going to draw in some super simplified shapes intending to kind of hint toward some sailboats on the water here. And we're going to use the masts and sails on these ships that are, looks like anchored, close to port or in the harbor. And we're going to use the masts of the ships to cut through that horizon line. And that will create the cross design stem that we're covering here in this little thumbnail sketch that we're creating for you. And there it is. There's one mast. We're going to do another one. And you can alter this to suit your objectives within your painting. In this case here, I'm just going to draw in a shape indicating a sail. So there's one sail up on this boat here in the foreground. Maybe there's just some tackle here or some lines that are tied to the boat that's just behind it. And maybe off in the distance there's another boat, which will indicate the shape will be quite a bit smaller because we want it to look as if it's off in the distance. Its mast is up, also piercing that horizon line. And you can see, I guess there's multiple crosses that you can identify here within this painting amongst those masts going up over the horizon line. And we'll just rough in some indications of some of the reflections on the water. And there's your cross design stem. Okay, we'll move on to the Radiating Line design stem. This is a fun one because in everyday life you can find scenes quite easily that would fall within this particular design stem. Anytime you're sitting in your car looking down the road, especially in an area where there's some open space, it's quite likely that you'll be able to see evidence of the Radiating Line design stem. So that's actually what I'm going to draw here. I've spent quite a bit of time in my car lately doing college visits and traveling for other things like track meets and soccer tournaments. So lots of time on the road, has given me the opportunity to see a lot of scenes like the one that I'm going to sketch out here. So you can see you have the two sides of the road converging off into the distance, indicating perspective. The dotted line in the center of the road getting smaller on this particular sketch. We're suggesting we're perhaps maybe on a country road. There's some hills and mountains off in the distance, and those two create radiating lines. Maybe there's some patterns, some brush and some grass, and maybe even some trees lined up that kind of accentuate this radiating line design stem. And then in addition to that, even the clouds sometimes, which I'll show you in a moment, can be arranged in a way where they create the suggestion of radiating lines, all drawing the eye into the painting, creating the illusion of depth, and drawing the eye off into the distance through the use of perspective. And it can be done in an obvious way or a subtle suggestion. In this case, sometimes we'll see clouds form in a way where certain types of clouds or streams of clouds will form, and you'll see them flow off into the distance. And when that happens, along the sky plane, you'll see evidence of that perspective coming into play, with the cloud mass kind of trailing off and becoming smaller off into the distance. And you can see here in this particular thumbnail sketch, there's evidence of radiating lines all over the place. And you can play with your design. You probably are better off if when utilizing perspective, if the vanishing point isn't in the middle of the painting, it'll help create a little bit of more of an interesting painting if you do that. But I did that here just for the sake of simplicity, and that's, again, the Radiating Line design stem. Okay, now we'll turn the page and we'll move on to the L or rectangle design stem. So this is a simple design, and it can be found throughout nature quite commonly. So if you are endeavoring to go out and paint on plein air, or if you're snapping some photos of some scenery that you plan on using to paint later on from reference, it's pretty easy to find this sort of design in nature. Anywhere there's trees or buildings, you'll have the opportunity to see this particular design stem, especially if you use your imagination and you don't take things too literally. So the idea here with this design stem is to capitalize on sometimes what you'll see is imbalance in a particular scene. Perhaps maybe you have some tall objects on one side or the other of the scene. In this case, we have a mass of trees on the left-hand side. We have some other things going on within the landscape, some other trees off in the distance, and some patterns within this field and some distant rolling hills. But that tall mass on the left-hand side of trees, which we're roughing in right now, is the dominant figure, and it frames what looks to be an L shape if you take the tree mass and the ground plane, and there's a rectangle that forms with that space left in the sky framed by the large tree mass and the ground plane. So this could be really effective, and it could help draw the eye in and around the painting for sure. So next we'll move on to the suspended Steelyard. Now this is one that I have not utilized all that much. I've only done a small number of paintings utilizing anything that isn't even resembles this particular design stem. Although I look forward to utilizing it more often in the future, you'll commonly see this utilized in paintings of harbors and coves where you might have some boats tied off, and you'll have a high horizon line, and you'll see the boats or the ships or the masts of the ships extend off of the surface, the viewing surface, and beyond the boundaries of your canvas. And what I tend to get from paintings that incorporate this particular design stem is a feeling of calmness and a reserved feeling, and in some cases maybe a stable kind of resolve as well. And I think it's because we maybe subconsciously associate this sort of scene with the end of a day, perhaps maybe the end of a sunny, beautiful day where we've had the opportunity to work or sail, out on the water, and or maybe fish on a dock or a pier somewhere. And the feelings, if you've ever done those sorts of things, that you'll get at the end of the day are ones that kind of fit those sentiments. You tend to feel, assuming the day went reasonably well, a little tired in a good way because you've had a lot of exercise and fresh air and vitamin D from the sun. And perhaps maybe you're about to enjoy a good meal and beautiful sunset. But in this case, what we're doing is we have a high horizon line. There's some hills along the shore there. We have the masts of these boats going up beyond the horizon line and even off the canvas. And then the reflections in the water cast by these boats are actually going to do most of the work, drawing the eye of the viewer up into the background of the scene And it'll just be by way of the subtle hints used to depict the reflections of the boats that will do most of the work in this case with the suspended Steelyard compositional format that we're working on here. So this is a thumbnail image. It's smaller than the size of my hand. It might be the size of a sketch that you might do if you're out in the field and you wanted to kind of sketch out and experiment with different compositional designs for your painting. And here we have just some basic squiggly lines indicating the reflections that might be in the water. And you can see, just like with the Steelyard earlier, there's a little imbalance. You have a dominant shape in the foreground. In this case, it's the boat, and then more importantly, the reflection of the boat in the water. And you have a smaller shape off in the background. And this does a good job. The juxtaposition of these larger and smaller shapes does a good job of commanding the viewer's eye to come into the painting, take notice of the star of the scene, which is that larger mass of ships or boats in the foreground, and then leading you to look back into the distance at the smaller boat, up along those reflections to the boats themselves, and maybe off into the background as well. Okay, now we're going to move on to a really fun compositional design stem offered through Edgar Payne's wonderful book, The Composition of Outdoor Painting. And this is called The Tunnel. Now, I am literally going to draw a tunnel as part of this. And I'm actually referencing the thumbnail image sketch that's included in Composition of Outdoor Paintings. This is kind of a classic tunnel that you might see within an older city where you have maybe a city wall that offers you a tunnel into the city or out of the city. In addition to that, you might see this in some architecture where maybe there's a mansion, a Gilded Age mansion that offers a tunnel into a garden or perhaps maybe outside of the property. So we're going to draw a little tunnel here. And mind you, this is within the context of discussing compositional designs for paintings. All these paintings that we're talking about, at least most of them, they will be made on a square or rectangle canvas or some substrate panel or what have you. Now, this particular compositional design is one of the more interesting ones because it really does a good job of forcing the viewer's eye into the central part of the painting. And you could do that in a number of ways. As you'll see in this instance, part of the manner by which that will occur is through the significantly differentiated contrast, the difference between the lights and darks that make up this particular scene. The tunnel itself that is within shadow will be dark naturally. And then in addition to that, the wall surrounding the entrance to the tunnel will be quite a bit darker than what you'll see in the background when peering through the tunnel. And there's a number of ways that you can accentuate this by the use of adding figures to the scene and also perhaps maybe supernatural depictions as well. You see this in a lot of paintings around the turn of the century that do that either through the use of dark, shadowy figures walking through a tunnel and that sort of thing. So it could really, really shift the mood. In this case, we are going to use very strong differentiation amongst the tonal qualities. The distant background that you see through the tunnel is going to be much lighter. It'll become obvious once we wrap up this sketch. And you can see I'm putting some indications very lightly, thin lines, pressing very lightly with the Sharpie that I'm using to suggest there's some buildings and some hills or mountains in the background. And we're going to leave a lot open to suggestion. We don't want to create a lot of detail, almost like we would handle the construction of shapes in a painting. So here you see I'm using cross-hatching, or hatching, which soon will become cross-hatching, to darken the exterior wall where the entrance to the tunnel is located. And soon I'll get working on building some shadow shapes in the foreground and within the tunnel walls and ceiling as well. Now the idea here is, much like you would do in a backlit forest scene, you might see darker shadow-covered trees in the foreground to help build depth. We're essentially going to use the same strategy here. Once this tunnel and the wall in the foreground and some of the shadows on the ground plane darken the foreground of the scene, you'll see it really does an effective job of creating distance and depth within this sketch, because the area through the other end of the tunnel really will drop back as a result of adding these darker areas. And this could be further enhanced when you move to the painting stage through the use of atmospheric perspective. Cooler colors mainly dominating the background with warmer colors, including those shadows, maybe some more warmer tones within the shadows, pulling the foreground forward. So it really, really can be an effective tool. It's also important to note that you don't need to be very literal in order to use the tunnel. You don't need to have a tunnel as part of your scene. Quite often, virtual tunnels will form when you're peering through the woods or a forest. If you happen to be looking at a pathway cutting its way through a forest, it oftentimes will create a similar effect, and you can incorporate that into your drawings and paintings quite easily. The same could be said for a doorway or a window if you're doing an internal scene or an interior scene. In addition to that, you see that in cityscapes and also additional opportunities within landscapes as well. If you're not on a trail, actually seeing a trail or a pathway cut its way through a forest, quite often a country road might do the same. And you'll see the combination of open space within the road or pathway and the tree canopy will create a tunnel for you. And you can arrange those pieces as you see fit to create similar depth and differentiation amongst contrast amongst different elements within your painting, like you see here. So that's the tunnel. Now, we're going to move on to the final design stem that I'm going to cover in this session. And this is one of my favorites, mainly because it is a design stem or compositional design that I can incorporate quite frequently based upon the real life scenes that I see here in the Pocono Mountains where I live, and that's the diagonal. And as I sketch this, I'm actually sketching this particular thumbnail from imagination. And the shapes that I'm using here, I've come to realize, are likely to be somewhat based upon stored memory. We have a couple of areas here just nearby where I will see shapes like this within the landscape, whether it be the Delaware Water Gap while viewing it from certain angles. And there's other areas too. A recent painting that I did on plein air in the snow at the Rail Gap Park, which is a locally owned park managed by Pocono Heritage Land and Trust here in the Poconos, includes a sloping hill like this, which I incorporated into the painting. And in this particular case, depending upon how you use this compositional design stem, particularly if you use compounding design stems, like in this case, we have somewhat of a compound S incorporated into it as well. It can provide opportunities to increase the depth that's perceived within the painting itself. It also creates drama. The diagonal lines themselves, if they're amongst the dominant shapes within a painting, within a scene, it can create drama, psychological tension, and you can enhance that further depending upon how you approach your scene. So for example, if I were to include, let's say, a shape of an animal or a hiker on that hill diagonally climbing up the side of the painting, it would create significant drama. So this is the diagonal line, compositional design stem. If you'd like to learn more about Edgar Payne and his book, Composition of Outdoor Painting, check out my blog on thomasmichaelnieman.com, where I actually have some helpful information, and also check out my 10-minute book review on my book review playlist. Thanks for checking out my video. Stay well. See you again.